How can a creature that falls apart at a touch says that it always wants to be happy? Your suffering is natural, and you people are meant to be chewed up. Yuji Tadori and Ryomen Sukuna have an interesting dichotomy that leads to them clashing many times throughout the story. Whether this be physically, verbally, or mentally, these two seem to always be at odds with one another some way or somehow, with the conflict between the two culminating into Yuji obsessing over Sukuna's eradication and Sukuna just being bored and tired of Yuji's resilience. Today I'll be studying both of these characters, how they contrast one another, and pointing out exactly why they cannot stand one another. We'll be starting with Yuji. Yuji Tadori is an extremely selfless teenager, maybe too selfless at times. He not only values the lives of his own comrades, but the lives of anybody that can be considered a person with their own will. As his grandfather once told him, to ensure that he'll have a proper death, he attempts to give those he faces the same opportunity, unless he genuinely hates them. Yuji will never resort to taking another human's life either, as he only goes that far as a last resort. What makes Yuji's selflessness so viable in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen and brings out more results than most is that when he decides to be selfless, he continues to remind himself and truly understand that he needs to continue protecting himself so he can protect others. Yuji continues dragging himself through such miserable circumstances so he can eventually seize the opportunity of obtaining all 20 fingers of Sukuna and removing himself from this world. This willpower allowing Yuji to struggle endlessly while having immense resilience to the events around him, because he now has a transcendent purpose, something that goes beyond him. But where the major flaw comes into play with this mindset is that Yuji is unable to recognize the true value of his own life. The only value he sees in his life is to eradicate Sukuna and nothing more. Yuji does not display any will to live for himself, and usually when Yuji goes as far as to affirm to himself that he was either to sacrifice himself or die for the sake of everybody, without even considering how everybody else would feel, he would always be punished by the story. And to even reinforce this, Sukuna himself has said to Yuji that if you indulge in your own interests more than you deserve to, you'll be punished. You should have learned the hard way, brat. And Sukuna, when taking over and possessing Yuji's body for the last time, states that, "What a thoroughly foolish brat, a binding vow not to hurt anyone yet, he didn't even include himself." This is where Yuji's selflessness begins to harm him, as it's not only because of this situation, but what Sukuna is effectively communicating to the audience is that Yuji cares about himself so little that when placing this binding vow to ensure that nobody could get hurt, he did not either care about or even consider the possibility of Sukuna harming himself, despite this already happening and being something that he should be conscious of. Yuji just seems to not care for his own life, and all of this has ironically resulted in Megami's possession. From recklessly allowing Sukuna to possess him, which created the binding vow, all the way to Yuji declaring that he'll finally be able to sacrifice himself to rid the world of Sukuna. And fate decided to intervene right after Yuji affirmed this to himself, with the possession of Sumiki and Sukuna's binding vow coming into play. Even now in this final arc, he's still acting very reckless, stating that he will eat anything if it gives him the chance to kill Sukuna. See, the tragic thing about Yuji Tadori is that he genuinely believed that the key to happiness and protection of all those he loved would have been at the sacrifice of himself after consuming all 20 fingers, without ever considering how those around him felt. Even when Yuji and Megami were negotiating with Angel, Megami considered Yuji's death to be a problem that they need to overcome in the first place, whereas Yuji was perfectly fine with it. Yuji Tadori is extremely selfless, and that's a good thing, but sometimes it can be to a fault. In the end, his grandfather cursed Yuji to be someone who helped others, and thus he will do anything to do so. Sukuna, on the other hand, is none less than the personification of selfishness. Sukuna dominated the entire Heian era to a point where he was revered as a god, and multiple villages hosted ceremonies just for him to be spared from his conquest. Sukuna seems to care for nothing more than himself, and it makes sense, as when he and Yuji last came to blows, he explained to Yuji quite clearly that his suffering is natural, that it's no less than deserved for being such a weak creature. Sukuna defines the value of those around him by who's strong and who's not. and Sukuna, for all of his time, was always the strongest. This is exactly why he's so selfish, because he sees himself as the being with the most value in the world. This is why Sukuna lives as a force of nature and sees anything that opposes this force as an incorrect way to live. When it comes to Sukuna, might makes right. This also explains why Sukuna agrees to marry Yorozu if he were to lose to her, because if she were able to match his power and remove the loneliness that she promised to remove from him once they first met, then she'd have as much, if not more, value to him in his eyes. Thus, he would have to oblige by her rules. But none could stand against him, at least until now. But even then, Gojo is still no more than just a fish that stands out a bit more than the rest. That's all. And speaking of this analogy, this is possibly where Sukuna's curse technique originates from, or at least references. How every human to Sukuna resembles a fish, waiting to be cut up and served to him in order to somewhat satisfy his hunger, and Gojo potentially being his most satisfying meal yet. Sukuna's perception of value relates directly with his love for battle and his upbringing in the Heian era, and with all these factors combined, a natural disaster is formed. This is why Yuji and Sukuna clash so many times throughout the story. And these two core traits are the traits that allowed Yuji to reach the epiphany that Sukuna was not a human, but a curse, both times. First against Mahito, when Yuji begged for Sukuna to help Junpei, saying that he'd do anything, but since Sukuna was too busy reveling in his own enjoyment, he simply laughed at Yuji. Yuji's selflessness and willing to sacrifice himself for Junpei, and Sukuna's selfishness and only focusing on his own enjoyment rather than anybody else. The second time being how Yuji questions Sukuna, asking how he can just hurt and ruin people's lives on a whim, whereas Sukuna responds with saying, "The weak do not deserve to be happy." Yuji's selflessness in speaking for everybody who's been hurt by Kenjaku Sukuna, and Sukuna's selfishness in completely refusing to even comprehend Yuji's perspective, and is too busy pushing his own onto him. These moments are what made Yuji understand that these people are not human. They are curses. Selfish and evil curses. If you notice, Yuji and Sukuna are the ones who point out the biggest flaw in the mindset of the other, because one represents what the other despises the most. It's truly masterful writing. If you even look at this picture here, it's an actual perfect representation of Sukuna and Yuji's characters, as Sukuna would turn his back on almost everybody, refusing to help them unless they directly added value to him, and Yuji would face and embrace anything as long as it's remotely benevolent. Yuji and Sukuna's mindsets are both ingrained into them, and they can never be changed due to both of the conditions surrounding them. So this leads me to believe that Yuji and Sukuna would always clash no matter what the circumstances behind their meeting are. They are both fundamentally opposite to one another, and they both stand against everything that the other stands for. And maybe we'll come to find out why Kenjaku says that there will always be chaos as long as the two of them coexist. I do believe that Yuji and Sukuna do not need to find a resolution to this conflict, as it will never be found without one killing the other. But I personally would like to see them meet one last time before the story concludes, but I really don't believe that is mandatory. All in all, that'll be my video for today. If you took the time to listen to this, thank you so much. Consider leaving a like, subscribing, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.